This is Dr. John Bennett from Miami, Florida. Tonight we have the pleasure of having Chris Madison, a gentleman from Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, I believe, works at Hartford Hospital. And Chris had the opportunity to work with Google Glass in kind of a different setting, kind of similar to Martin of Chloe, I guess, down in Tennessee. Um, Apparently Chris worked with Google Glass and worked with medical simulation for teaching and for medical education. So I'll let Chris more fully introduce himself. And okay, Chris, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Um, yeah, so definitely we use glass partly for education, but I think what the biggest thing that we did differently is we use simulation as a test bed for developing applications. So rather than jump through all the hoops of HIPAA, as well as fully fleshing out an app that works with EMR or integrates with said defibrillators, whatever technology you want to integrate with, if you can kind of simulate that environment and test your app there, then you can get an idea of whether or not your concept has any merit before you invest the large amount of man hours required to physically develop the entire prototype, as well as you don't have to worry about patient safety or any kind of patient data risks and so forth. So that's mainly how we use simulation in our facility. We did a little bit with video recording, um, simulations, training, so forth, as well as actual procedures, operating room procedures. Um, but to us, the main benefit of glass is the screen. There's lots of different video recording systems out there that you can wear, some better than others, but the real benefit to us for glass is being able to see information discreetly all the time. So we could instantly send a notification to anyone at any time with information specific to their current situation.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll save the questions for later. I guess you're going to do a little PowerPoint or
Yep, yep.
okay.
I'm just pulling up our presentation.
Okay. So working okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Here we go. Yeah, we just had a couple different versions.
Oh, okay.
So I'll start with this. Let's do a screen share.
Okay. There we go. Yeah, heart rate 64.
Yep. So this is a one of the app concepts that we started working on is basically the ability to provide really short, simple um, information to a physician. So things like anytime the heart rate would change, maybe while they were outside the room, if it became a dangerously low, you'd have something indicating what the metric was, that it was low. We
Right.
actually had concepts for really low, which turned the back of the card white, um, which when glass comes on with a white background, it's really, really bright
Mhm.
and really draws your attention no matter what you're doing. So for things like codes and so forth, um, it definitely gets their attention and makes sure that they respond immediately. But that's one of those things that we came to by testing it out in a simulated environment. So originally we had the same card with two down arrows for a really low heart rate, and we found in our simulated environment that people didn't pick that up as often as we wanted to. So sometimes when they were subjected to this one enough, they'd become somewhat desensitized to the really low one, and they'd see them pretty much the same. So we knew we had to switch them up a little bit and differentiate between low and very low.
Okay.
Um, and so we experimented in the simulation environment by changing the background, changing some of the colors around, and that's when we came to the conclusion that the white background really shone out a lot more and stood out more than the black background with white text. But we also noted some other things we were testing. For example, red um, usually looks more yellowish, orangish when
Mhm.
you have a solid red on glass. So we actually had to color correct a little bit to make things come out red, especially when we were doing kind of a red, yellow, green theme for good, bad, and in between.
Mhm.
So those are some of those things that you really have to pick up just by testing, experimenting. And for us, we wanted to make sure that that experimentation happened in a safe environment, but also one as close to clinical as we could possibly get.
Was this a real app?
It was one that we developed in-house. It does function. We can bring up our web portal and basically select which type of alert we want to send, put in the heart rate values, and send it to the clinician. It's
Okay.
not fully functional in the way that you would integrate it into your EMR or your monitoring system or so forth. Our focus was on testing the idea to see if having this information made a difference in their shifts. If they had multiple patients and they saw this information, would they respond appropriately? Um, Basically, more usability studies and testing the actual concept than trying to create an app that had actual marketable potential or something we could start rolling out immediately in our ERs.
Okay.
Um, but the response was very good. A lot of the people wearing it thought it could definitely help out, had a lot of potential.
Okay.
We're still working on kind of fine tuning it, trying to get it to the point that it it has a lot of the features that we think would make it useful without getting in the way. We don't want to send so much information that they're even more overloaded than they are. And so I'm trying to balance that information overload, which is one of the main reasons we pursued the app in the first place, is to reduce information overload on the floors. There's
Right.
tons of alarms everywhere, lots of different equipment they have to learn, and it's not always obvious how to interact with that technology, what each alarm means. They end up managing multiple alarms. Maybe the ventilator's going off. A nurse may not know exactly how to treat that, so they have to go get a respiratory therapist. So our goal was to try to streamline most of those audible alarms and visual cues on the monitor, so forth. For example, interpreting ECGs. If we could have a system or algorithm that automatically interpreted that EKG, like a lot of the Zolls do, and sent the alert, the patient's in VT, rather than having someone have to constantly monitor that rhythm to see if there's any fluctuations from a central desk. If they ever step out or they happen to be looking at another one and miss some things, they may miss small runs of VT or small runs of VTAC that otherwise could provide detailed or insightful information to the physician.
Okay.
Uh, so our plan was to sort of analyze if we had everything in place that worked um, in an actual floor and we ran a simulation, what kind of benefit would the caretakers get out of that? And
Mhm.
from that, we could tune which pieces we wanted to focus on actually developing for implementation.
Mhm.
So for one of the other examples is we focused on or experimented with video intubation. Um, so for example, a student or resident who is intubating might be able to live stream their view to their attending
Right.
um, in the ED so they could tell if they're using the right technique, if they're able to get a view of the cords and so forth. Um, or even better for uh, them to be able to grab like a video laryngoscope that was wirelessly connected to glass and intubate without having to pull over an airway cart, without having to learn some of the more complicated or difficult techniques with a regular laryngoscope.
Right.
And it showed promise, but the view didn't quite match up 100% with the learner's view.
Mhm.
Um, and displaying the output of the actual airway device on the display for glass proved problematic, even though it had potential. And so
Okay.
we decided in our simulation environment that if we couldn't make it work reliably here, there's no way we could make it work reliably on a patient floor.
Okay.
And so we decided to focus on other areas.
Okay. Do you go into the redesign of the glass itself or something like that, or you just kind of don't
No,
mess with
no.
the design?
Yep, the glass for our purposes is the hardware is not something we're going to have a lot of control over.
Okay.
Uh, I know there's the possibility that you could manufacture your own device similar to glass,
Right.
uh, or potentially talk to Google about creating a custom version of glass. But we were more interested in what we could do with it now with the technology we had,
Okay.
uh, which even that there's lots of doors that you could open just with glass the way it is.
Hmm.
But we wanted to focus on finding the ideas that had the most potential uh, before we started focusing on trying to build an app that fulfilled that or perceived potential.
Right.
So there's so many different things that you could do with glass, so many different ideas, but rarely do people have time to pursue all of them. They have to
Right.
focus on specific ones. And so we decided to kind of flesh out each concept to the point that it was mostly functional in a simulated environment. So for example, in places where we would integrate it into an EMR, we substituted, our own small personal data set rather than go through um, all the labor required in actually integrating with an EMR
Mhm.
and see how it runs as if it was connected to an EMR.
Okay.
Based on that information, we could make decisions about which branch we wanted to pursue in detail.
Okay. Have you seen other apps that do vital signs for the Glass app, Google Glass, or no?
I have in limited exposure. I've seen a few videos of, for example, one app that worked in an operating room, so that while the surgeon was performing surgery, they had a live stream of the patient's vitals. They could see the actual rhythm strip on
Right.
glass,
Right.
use head motions to kind of control it. And I think that has a lot of potential.
Okay.
We were focused more on, rather than some of the real-time monitoring, where you still have to watch that data, you still have to filter it, understand it. Instead, we wanted to focus on data analysis so that raw data is being analyzed by some kind of data central server and then being sent out to the people who need it most at that point in time.
Okay.
So, for example, one version of that we might look at is taking that rhythm strip, that heart rate, SpO2, respiratory rate, analyzing all of that in a server. If it sees a change, for example, if it drops below a threshold, or if it sees the rhythm change from sinus to ATAC or VTAC or VFib, to then send an alert to the surgeon. So most of the time the glass display would be off, and then
Hmm.
all of a sudden they'd get alert, they're in VT, and then maybe you'd see your live stream so you could keep an eye on it.
Hmm.
Um, Rather than having it running live and maybe the surgeon got a little preoccupied with their surgery and forgot to look up at glass and notice the VTAC. I mean, hopefully there'd be alarms and so forth built in that would go off and an alarm and they'd look up at it then.
Hmm.
Um, but our goal is trying to reduce the amount of information or raw data that
Right.
goes to physicians and nurses and increase the amount of actual beneficial information that goes to them.
Now, are these parameters adjustable by the user or are they hardwired into the program?
For our concept testing, they were mostly hardwired, so we consulted with a lot of physicians. One of the benefits of being hospital-based is there's
Okay.
no shortage of physicians, and most of them have a great interest in glass and are more than happy to provide
Okay.
information, ideas, concepts. So we worked very closely with different types of physicians to develop our kind of concepts, and for the sake of speed, to get these concepts ready for testing, mostly everything's hardwired, but they're fairly easy to change for our concept if we decided we needed to tweak things.
Right.
And if we ever did wanted to release a real, somewhat commercial version into our ER, it would definitely have more flexible parameters that would be loaded from a database so we could adjust them on the fly.
Well, I'll tell you why that's relevant because last night we had an anesthesiologist who oversees students, and he wants to have a different uh, set point for himself as opposed to the residents. He wants the residents to have a higher set point. So there's a couple of parameters he has, like for say pulse. One, the resident gets notified. The other one, he gets notified because he oversees like two or three residents. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
But that's down the road, I guess.
yeah. So you'd want to essentially personalize each each person's alarm settings or similar,
Yeah.
so that maybe the instructor gets different values than the student. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, well, every instructor is different too. Maybe some instructors will use one, but they're both resident and attending and notified. But yeah, that I guess that's to be worked on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's one of the other things that we've been exploring with Glass is I'm sure you're familiar with Watson
Yes.
and the IBM somewhat supercomputer that's bringing cognitive analytics to a whole new level.
Yes.
So there's a lot of potential, I think, for that with Glass, where in your environment you could have Glass taking in a lot of the information the physician's taking in. So a lot of the spoken words could be analyzed in real time to try and build kind of a history for that patient. So maybe the physician says, I'm thinking about giving epinephrine to this patient. And then Watson could be analyzing that in the background and discover that this patient would most likely result negatively to epinephrine because of some family history or some drug they're taking or some new research,
Okay.
and provide feedback to the physician as kind of a check back.
Uh-huh.
So physicians could potentially check some of their decisions against Watson in real time with such a device, and it'd be a little bit easier than pulling out their cell phone every time they needed to do it, or even a smartwatch holding it up, because Glass could just listen all the time and provide feedback as needed.
Well, that brings in a larger issue for other uses of glass too. If Watson will be more involved with decision making,
Yeah,
not just in an ER, but in any any area of glass use.
yeah, definitely. When we look at things like Watson, I mean, it shows a lot of potential on its own, even for completely transforming medicine.
Hmm.
And I'm hoping that wearable computing has that same potential. I believe it does,
Hmm.
uh, mostly in bringing technologies like Watson and some of the even more advanced artificial intelligence systems that have been simmering these last few years into the hands of people who need it most the moment they need it. So wearables is basically bridging the gap between humans and technology in ways that we haven't had before.
Yeah.
Um, Even some of the more advanced concepts, even beyond Google Glass, things like the iTap that have been developing for years, they haven't actually gone commercial yet, but the idea of an iTap basically captures everything that you see in video exactly as you see it because the camera's in the same position as your eye, um, supplies that to a computer which can analyze that information and then display an overlay immediately over your vision so that you could see, for example, while you were doing a surgery, it could overlay the MRI
Hmm.
over your vision, um, basically so you could see inside the patient at the same time you were operating with
Hmm.
maybe laparoscopic surgery. So there's a lot of potential that wearables will unlock, I think, in the next couple of years. And glass is just that first stepping stone, mainly because it's the first one to actually come out with a consumer grade product that actually seems to have everything that you'd need up front. There's a lot more, I think, to come, but that's definitely a good start.
Yeah, there's going to be lots of data out there that needs to be interpreted by something, by some computer. I mean,
Yep.
there'll be wearables for everything, for all vitals and all type of variables of bodily functions.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
But one of the other things we wanted to talk about
Right.
regarding simulation is the fact that data security is another major issue for hospitals these
Mhm.
days. And it has been for quite a while, but especially with the HIPAA regulations that updated a few years ago, where the fines increased substantially. Any hospital that has systems that integrate with other technologies, the IT security administrators that oversee those integrations tend to be a little reluctant when you bring up the topic of Google Glass,
Yes.
especially because it's so new, it's untested, um, it's designed predominantly to send everything to Google, which would be a nightmare if your server was suddenly exposed completely to Google servers, which are not HIPAA secured at the moment. I believe there's talk about some of Google services can be made somewhat HIPAA compliant if you have a prior agreement written with them, a contract.
Mhm.
But most of the time, people are using Glass. It's with their own personal accounts. So I know there was some issues when Glass first came out, and a lot of surgeons were anxious to get Glass up and running in their institutions,
Mhm.
and they ran into some difficulties with HIPAA, where some of the videos they took might have been uploaded to Google. Um, Even with consent, it's still sometimes considered a HIPAA violation if the right information is not concealed.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big benefits we've seen to experimenting in simulated environment is you can do almost everything you could in a real one,
Right.
but you don't have to worry about the patient's data leaking because it's not a real patient.
Right. Okay. Well, you're going to change that slide because it's not. It's the same slide, Chris. I don't know if you wanted to change them or not.
Sure, yeah. Let
Okay.
me switch back to video for a moment here.
Yeah. I thought maybe it got stuck because sometimes it gets stuck.
No, no, it would just there's just some of the concepts. Most of them are pretty similar. There's heart
Okay.
rate, SpO2, lab results, but they're all fairly similar. I probably have a few other ones I can show.
Okay.
But did you have any questions specific to some of the stuff that we're doing?
Well, that's
Um,
you mentioned that it's basically for the ER. That's this particular app.
yep.
Uh,
So the Go ahead.
okay. You haven't used it in the ER itself on a real patient, right? It's all simulated.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Our medical director, or our director of cognitive simulation, rather, is an ER physician.
Okay.
And for a while, was co-chair of our emergency medicine residency program.
Okay.
So he's been working very closely with the residents. The residents are up in our simulation center a lot, and we saw a lot of value in trying to help them make decisions, especially because time's so critical in an emergency room.
Right.
That we could use Glass to kind of streamline information, get it to them as quickly as possible. One of the early instances where that became an issue is with um, codes, so with medical alerts, cardiac arrest, those kinds of things.
Mhm.
When they happen in the emergency room, you want your residents to respond to them, but you don't want all your residents to respond to them. So
Right.
they've tried a couple different things of trying to regulate that. They
Mhm.
tried assigning a resident, but a couple of times that resident was busy and so they couldn't respond. And so no one ended up responding to those codes, which is probably the worst thing you could have. Um, so they ended up going to a system where they just call it overhead and the residents respond. If there's already a resident on scene, those residents who arrive after him have to go back to what they were doing. But that pulls them away from the patients they were seeing. They have to come back. There's sometimes information that gets lost in that. So if you were in the middle of something, you got called away. Sometimes when you go back, you may not remember exactly what it was you were doing, what number it was you were writing down for labs, all kinds of different things that could be lost.
Uh-huh.
Um, so one of the things we experimented with Glass is sending alerts to a specific resident who's kind of the assigned resident for that code. And he has 10 seconds to confirm that he's going to the code by tapping the side of Glass before it rolls over to the next resident. So
Uh-huh.
you can kind of streamline your operations even within the ED, um, aside from patient care, just trying to streamline um, basically the flow of your personnel that has potential for impacting patient care.
How do the residents like working with the glass?
Most of them are pretty excited. A lot of them like trying it on, experimenting with it, um, and so forth. So we've gotten pretty good responses from them,
Hmm.
as well as the attendings. The attendings see a lot of potential in it as well, for monitoring how their residents are doing over time.
In their limited experience, do they feel like it's going to streamline seeing patients, etc.?
Yeah, I would say so. The feedback's been mostly positive that it does make things easier once all that stuff's integrated, though, which is the real challenge, is jumping through all the hoops of getting it cleared for clinical use
Right,
is one of those main things, especially if you're doing direct um, patient intervention, so to speak. So things like calling a cardiac alert, where if there was some kind of malfunction in glass and they didn't get that alert, you could have potential
yeah, problems.
damage or risk to the patient.
Okay,
Getting that cleared for use is going to require FDA approval.
right,
Um, so it's not something we've been able to do in a clinical environment yet, but
right.
we're starting to build data to support the fact that it does have an impact in the simulated environment in order to grease the wheels a little bit, so to speak, to provide um, evidence to the FDA as well as potential to any backers if we wanted to pursue investors
Hmm.
that it does make a difference. And even to the clinical or the medical community at large to show them that there really is potential in glass, and it does warrant further investigation by other facilities and in even more areas.
Right. Okay. Are you going to show us something else, Chris?
Yep, just checking.
Do you record these sessions at all and show them to other residents or other attendings?
We've done a little bit with recording some of the sessions and playing them back with the glass information overlaid. It's difficult to do,
Okay.
to record what glass sees as well as what the resident sees and try to put it together.
Okay.
Um, so we've done mostly snapshots where we can take a screenshot of what's on glass and then show it to the attending with the student's information overlaid, but it tends to be more set up, more scripted
Okay.
as to show some of the concepts and how they would actually look to the student while they were doing it than they are actually recording the cases.
Okay.
We have done some with recording the case and then afterwards try to recreate what the student saw and overlaid it, but it's difficult to do.
Okay.
So we've only done it once.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time
It's okay.
finding this one. But on the development side, when you look at development for glass,
Okay.
um, one of the things we found to be useful in accelerating our development is starting with some of the really, really basic demos that you can get from the Glass website and just modifying them even slightly. You can start creating or experimenting with apps in your own facility. So if you follow the developer um, guidelines and kind of intro on the development for Glass website, you can actually start sending cards to Glass just in HTML. So you could easily, and there's even like helpers on there where you don't even need to know HTML. You can just put in the text, select an image, and upload it. If you know HTML, you can go right to the HTML. You can design the HTML for the card. You just paste it and you hit
Right.
send, and it'll go right to Glass. So you can see what it'll look like. You could string those together if you wanted to do kind of an actual live simulation. So you
Right.
can send multiple cards. You can create different bundles and so forth. And it's all pretty easy to do right from their website. So we started with that, and from there kind of evolved into creating the actual app that's a little bit more streamlined, where we have a web portal that we can bring up. I'll see if I can get to that.
So
Um,
you're talking about modifying the code, the basic code that Google gives you, right?
you don't even have to actually modify any code
No?
um, to begin. You can just go to
Oh, it's
a
like a
portal.
macromedia. You just the code is interpreted or changed automatically.
Most of the cards that go to Glass are actually just HTML that gets sent from the Google server.
Okay.
Um, so they have created, um, they call it the playground, I believe, where you can send cards to your Glass device if you authorize it without having to do too much. Most of it's all stuff you do through Google's website, and then you can just send the cards to your Glass. So I'm going to pull up that in a
Chris,
moment.
I'm not a programmer of Glass apps. What is a card? Is that like a page of code?
Yep, so I'm going to share with you this website.
Okay.
So this is the Google developers site
Oh,
for Glass.
yeah, that's good.
Yep, and under tools and downloads, there's something called the playground.
Oh,
So,
wow. So
yep,
anybody can go in here.
exactly, yep. Glass is designed with a user interface that kind of revolves around the concept of these cards. So a card is basically just a page that is on Glass that you can swipe through.
Right.
Um, so things are arranged in your timeline. Cards get inserted into your timeline. So your clock is kind of the center of that timeline.
Okay.
To the right of it are things that happened recently and they get inserted. So the most recent card is always the one immediately to the right of the clock.
Okay.
And then the ones to the left are things that are more ongoing. So things like the weather, um, your Google Now cards, and so forth, they're all pinned to the left of the clock,
Hmm.
whereas the ones to the right are part of your timeline.
Wow.
So this lets you go to even say something like this, and you can go over here and you can just change the text to be, let's try patient fell out of bed.
Okay.
And if you authorized your Glass to use this page, which
Right.
there's instructions on how to do that up in I believe samples and demos when you go to getting started or API guides and quick start. It'll walk you through how to do that.
Hmm.
But once you authorize Glass to use this page,
Okay.
uh, you put in whatever you want there, and there's a send button that'll come up after you authorize. and you'd be able to send it right to Glass. So
To
it
your
just
particular glass? I mean, it has a code number or something?
um, it's not as much putting in information from your Glass as much as your Glass is synced to your Gmail account.
Oh,
So
okay, that's
you,
cool. So you make it in your Gmail account. You make the app in your Gmail account.
yep. So if I hit authorize there, it will I'll authorize it, and it's
Wow,
usually as easy as that. So it's now synchronized to my Gmail account. So
right?
if I hit insert item, it'll actually send that to my Glass.
Wow, that's fantastic. I didn't know that. That's a big point.
Yeah, and there's all a bunch of templates here too. You can go through a lot of these templates, things like a table. Like this is a pretty nice design. So you can go in and just edit the HTML here
Okay,
uh, if you wanted. So you could do maybe heart rate
cool,
and then
man.
get rid of that and so forth. And you could actually change the text to whatever you wanted it to say
Wow.
and
So
then send it.
someone with a basic understanding of HTML can toy with this.
Yep. So it's a good way to test out your concepts too. One of the easiest ways to do that too, if you aren't even familiar with HTML, is you could create an image, just a regular image, maybe open PowerPoint, throw it through shapes together, and save that slide as a picture.
Uh-huh.
And then you could easily just use the most basic of HTML code to upload just your image to it. So
Hmm.
you'd just be sending the image of your card, and it would show up on Glass so you could see exactly how that image looks on Glass,
Right.
and decide if you need to tweak anything, particularly along the edges. Glass tends to eat into the edges a little bit.
Right.
So there's actually a whole guide too on. They've reworked the layout of the site a little bit, but there is a bunch of different guides that you can use that tell you when you're designing a card, like what the gutters have to be along the sides, how much space you have to leave between text, what fonts look best on Glass, what colors are recommended by Google.
Wow.
Um, this, for example, you always have to account for when you're designing because it's always going to be there on your card when you insert it.
Right.
Um, and this is something called the Mirror API, which is basically a system set up that allows you to send information to the Google servers that administer your Glass, and those servers can then send that HTML card to your specific Glass.
Uh-huh.
Um, there are other ways to program for Glass too that give you more flexibility, but require a lot more technical knowledge. So that gets more into the GDK or Glass Development Kit,
Hmm.
which is developing an Android application that actually runs on your Glass standalone,
Hmm.
whereas Mirror API ones are focused more on server-based. So our first app for Glass was actually set up on a free Google server under their, I believe it was App Engine, something along those lines, where it's a free server you can develop. There's already in these guides, there's sample code that you can use to deploy to the server.
Hmm.
You just have to modify it slightly, and it'll allow you to send your own HTML to Glass whenever you visit that page and you click on whatever buttons you happen to add. So that's what we did with ours, is set up a few basic buttons for sending different types of cards, um, and just integrated that into a page, which made it a little easier. You could theoretically do it all using this page, but it'd be
Hmm.
a lot of copy your HTML, paste it here, send, copy, paste, send, rather than a more fluid, you just click a button to send a particular card, type in a value and hit send type stuff.
Well, Chris, we got to get going because we got another hangout. But, geez, I'd love it if you could do maybe another hangout just on the code, this particular part of the presentation of the coding and how to put together an app. I mean, that would be super. I think
Yeah, sure.
it doesn't
So
sound like it's real technical. It sounds like pretty well most people with a basic grasp of HTML can make a rudimentary program.
Yeah, definitely make a rudimentary design. The design is one of the biggest pieces for glass in the first place.
Yeah.
Um, Once you've got the design down, then developing the actual backbone for the app is pretty basic for most apps that are going to be kind of entry-level concept testing. When
Okay.
you get into more advanced things, like for example, if you wanted to monitor CPR in real time as you were doing it and provide feedback, as I know some people are already doing, you'd require something that actually ran on glass and had access to its sensor data. And that gets a lot more complicated where you need a more technical developer to actually aid you with that.
Uh-huh.
But if you wanted to purely send information to glass and get minimal information back, so mostly notification engine,
Uh-huh.
very easy to start setting that up for concept testing using something like the playground, and then develop a more comprehensive one for their web server with your own maybe app engine server.
Mhm.
And then from there, if you have even more complex stuff, you could stick with just that. A lot of people do.
Mhm.
A lot of the existing Glass apps out there run just off the Mirror API, so just off the web interface.
Mhm.
And that's the one that Google tells you you should try to use if you can, the Mirror API.
Mhm.
And only if the Mirror API can't do something that you need to do should you switch over to the GDK, which runs things live on Glass. So you don't even need to necessarily have an internet connection, and your app will still run,
Mhm.
depending on what it does.
Right. Well, that's great. Okay, super. Well, we have the meat of another talk, and maybe after the conference, you can, we can get together for another hangout. Can you get off the screen share, Chris, so
Sure.
we can close it here? Yeah, I really appreciate you coming out tonight. And with that, I would love to have a session with that. It sounds like Google's trying to get people to collaborate and to do stuff for Glass, uh, which is great. Oh, I guess open source, right?
Yeah, well, even more I mean, Google's always been open source. Android itself, the whole operating system is mostly open source. So their big push right now is to get apps. They want apps. Um, it's hard to
Well,
commercialize something without an app market, and it's been growing leaps and bounds, but it still has a ways to go.
yeah, it'll get bigger in every aspect of medicine. Well, I got to get going to the next hangout. So, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you to the next hangout.
All right, have a good night.
Okay, good night.